In May 1945, the Second World War in Europe came to an end. But while peace returned to the continent, the aftermath left behind thousands of German tanks, Panthers, Tigers, Panzer IVs, scattered across roads, forests, and the ruins of bombed-out factories. These steel beasts, once the pride of Hitler's armoured forces, were now abandoned wrecks or partially dismantled shells. The Allies were faced with a practical question. What would become of Germany's once formidable tank fleet? When Nazi Germany officially surrendered on May 8, 1945, its armoured divisions were a shadow of their former strength. Months of retreat, crippling fuel shortages, and relentless Allied bombing had left many vehicles stranded or cannibalised for parts. From the industrial Ruhr to the Bavarian countryside and the outskirts of Berlin, Allied soldiers discovered tanks deserted in various states of disrepair, often missing engines, radios, or turrets. In many cases, German crews had deliberately sabotaged their vehicles before surrendering, rendering them immobile. With the war over, Allied forces quickly moved to secure these vehicles. In the American zone, US technical intelligence teams documented tanks at sites like Oberursel and Geildorf. The British performed similar efforts at Hillersleben and Sennelager, while Soviet trophy brigades recovered German armour across Eastern Europe and Berlin. The condition of these tanks varied widely. Some were near intact but mechanically unreliable. Others had been stripped for parts, and many prototypes or late-war hulls were incomplete due to disrupted wartime production. By the summer of 1945, most of the remaining German tanks sat in Allied-controlled depots. From this point, attention shifted from collecting to studying. The Allies, particularly the US and Britain, were keen to analyse what had made German armour so effective in battle. Select models were shipped overseas or tested at military proving grounds. For the US, the centre of this research became Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. From late 1945, American engineers tested Tigers, Panthers, and assault guns for gunnery performance, mechanical reliability, and armour resistance. Their findings were clear. German tanks featured superb firepower and optics, but suffered from chronic reliability issues, especially in gearboxes and final drives. The British ran their own evaluations primarily within Germany. Comparing German designs with their own Sherman and Churchill tanks, British engineers were impressed with sloped armour and high-quality optics, but maintenance crews struggled to service the over-engineered vehicles in field conditions. These lessons would later influence early Cold War military design, though they did not immediately lead to British production of German-style tanks. The Soviets had a different approach. They collected large numbers of German tanks, notably Panzer IVs, Panthers and Stugs, for training. Tests largely confirmed their wartime observations: strong frontal armour and powerful guns, but unreliable mechanics under harsh conditions. By the early 1950s, most German tanks in Soviet hands were scrapped once spare parts ran out. More critical discoveries came from Germany's former research and production sites. At places like Kummersdorf, Hillersleben, and Haustenbeck, Allied teams uncovered prototypes, spare parts, and incomplete vehicles, including remnants of the massive Maus Super Heavy tank and elements of the experimental E-series. These finds offered valuable insight into late-war German engineering that had never reached full production. As occupation policies solidified, all German armoured vehicles were to be documented, secured, and prevented from reuse. A debate followed among Allied planners. Should these tanks be studied, redistributed, or destroyed? Each power took a different path. The US prioritised testing, the Soviets stockpiled, then scrapped. And Britain, limited by resources, evaluated fewer tanks on site. Despite these differences, Allied reports reached similar conclusions. German tanks combined advanced technology and firepower with overly complex maintenance-heavy designs. Once testing ended, the Allies faced the logistical problem of disposing of the vast remains of Hitler's armoured force. From 1946 to 1948, the Allied Control Council issued directives for the destruction of German military equipment. Tanks, spare parts, and prototypes were classified as prohibited materials. This began a massive demilitarization effort, centered in industrial zones like the Ruhr and Saxony. In places such as Bochum, Essen, and Magdeburg, lines of tanks were cut apart by torches and machinery. The resulting steel helped rebuild Germany's post-war infrastructure: bridges, factories, and homes. In rural areas, some tanks were repurposed for environmental engineering. Along Austria's Enns River, bulldozed Panthers were used to stabilize riverbanks. In Central Europe, tanks were dumped in quarries and landslide zones as makeshift reinforcement. Over time, these armoured hulks disappeared beneath soil and vegetation, becoming part of the landscape. Other vehicles were used as gunnery targets. The British, Americans, and Soviets placed German tanks on firing ranges to test new ammunition and train crews. Once too damaged for further use, they were broken down or abandoned in place. Clean-up efforts also took place across Eastern Europe. In Poland and Czechoslovakia, wrecks were removed from roads and forests and either scrapped or repurposed in land reclamation. Prototypes and research vehicles met similar fates. Most were dismantled, and few survived. While rumours of hidden bunkers full of Panthers or secret tank caches persist, available evidence shows that most of Germany's tanks were indeed destroyed by 1948. Yet not all German tanks vanished. A smaller number continued in service, with foreign militaries rebuilding after the war. These vehicles provided a temporary solution for countries that lacked modern armour. France was an early and heavy user, incorporating Panthers into its 503rd Combat Tank Regiment. French crews admired their firepower and optics, but poor reliability and scarce spare parts led to their retirement by 1951. Still, these tanks influenced French doctrine during a crucial rebuilding phase. Czechoslovakia played a special role, having produced German tanks during the war. After 1945, it continued building the Hetzer, or G13, and sold many to Switzerland, which used them well into the Cold War. Panzer IVs and Stugs were also used before Soviet armour became standard. Other Eastern European nations, including Romania, Bulgaria, and Yugoslavia, used captured or redistributed German tanks in the immediate post-war years. Romania used Panzer IVs for training, while Bulgaria incorporated various models into early armoured units before switching to Soviet designs by the mid-1950s. Spain, meanwhile, had received Panzer IVs and Stugs during the war from Nazi Germany. These remained in service until the late 1960s, when 17 surviving Panzer IVs were sold to Syria. In a surprising twist, Syria kept these tanks operational into the early 1970s, deploying them along the Golan Heights, one of the last known combat uses of German WW2 tanks. Maintaining these vehicles was always a challenge. Without standardized parts or manuals, mechanics had to improvise, cannibalizing other tanks and fabricating components. Despite these limitations, German tanks helped shape early Cold War military planning. By the mid-1950s, most countries had phased them out, turning instead to modern American or Soviet designs. The remaining Panthers, Tigers, and Panzer IVs found their way into museums or became historical monuments. Today, preserved tanks at institutions like the Tank Museum in Bovington, the Musée de Blains in Saumur, and the Kubinka Museum in Russia stand as rare reminders of the machines that once roared across Europe.